Just want to say a couple words about Exodus, given that we are approaching Passover, and the Exodus is associated with the Passover feast. Historically, the Exodus appears to be a national origins myth developed by King Josiah in the 7th century BCE in order to appropriate the legacy of Israel, both the northern kingdom of Israel, which was a considerable regional power, and associated with a Yahweh only religion, a monotheistic religion that he hoped would bring unity to the disparate tribal groups that he ruled from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a uh, minor city with a small population. It certainly was not the home of the United Kingdom of David and Solomon, which are essentially also appropriated national origins myths. The Exodus might have an association with the Hyksos invasions of Egypt, which did take place around 1700 BCE, invasions or penetrations. Certainly, the Hyksos dominated Egypt between 1700 BCE and about 1550 BCE, when Amos the first defeats the Hyksos and forces them to depart from Egypt in a violent series of campaigns. The Hyksos themselves, archaeology tells us, were essentially a Semitic-speaking people from Canaan, with perhaps some Indo-European tribal groups. The Hyksos invasion or penetration of Egypt was detailed by a Hellenistic historian, Manetho, who wrote the Egyptica. Unfortunately, the book has been lost as a result of the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, but his work was cited by Josephus, Flavius Josephus, and we know that Manetho associated the Hyksos with the patriarchs of Genesis. Certainly, archaeology made some very exciting discoveries. That is, they found a Hyksos ring belonging to a king whose name was Jacob. This, of course, fits very nicely with the patriarch Jacob, or Israel, of Genesis. The Further on, Manetho talks about the Exodus as being the expelling of the Hyksos. So the Hyksos do provide a kind of source material for the Bible's Exodus story. But it's clear that the Exodus story was used by King Josiah in order to create a monotheistic tradition based on the worship of Yahweh only, which really begins to develop around the 7th century BCE. But Judaism itself does not develop the forms that we are familiar with until the Second Temple period, from about 539 BCE to about 70-73 CE, with the destruction of the temple by the Romans. It is only then that you have a truly functioning monotheistic Judaism. Before that, you have certainly conflict between the Canaanite traditions and polytheistic religions, and the growing monotheism of the Judahite state, that is, the state ruled by the kings of Judah from Jerusalem. We have no archaeological evidence that the Exodus took place during the proposed time frame, the biblical time frame, which sets the Exodus 480 years before the building of the first temple by Solomon. That would put the Exodus somewhere in the reign of Thutmose III, a very unlikely pharaoh, since he was a very successful military campaigner in Canaan, was not reputed to have lost any major battles, nor have had a major slave rebellion and exodus flowing out of Egypt. And of course, the original Hebrew of detailing the Exodus story tells us that there were at least 600,000 slaves leaving under the leadership of Moses, and that they went armed, despoiling the Egyptians along the way. None of that is chronicled during the reign of a very successful military pharaoh, Thutmose III, nor do we have any archaeological record of any such type of defeat or exodus of slaves in the reign of Ramses II, which is late 14th century and early to mid 13th century. And none of that is chronicled either. You have the Mernetta stele by Ramses' son, erected by Ramses' son, Mernetta, around 1200, that speaks of the having scattered the seed of Israel. But the seed of Israel is not exactly synonymous with the Jews or the Israelites of biblical record. Therefore, we have the tantalizing suggestion that around 1200 there might have been incursions into Canaan, successful incursions, but nothing that speaks of a mass movement of slaves or major unsuccessful campaign by the Egyptian pharaohs. The only instance where we find such a historical record is with the Hyksos, and the Hyksos basically do provide a tantalizing clue on the Exodus, because they were Semitic-speaking people from Canaan. They may have had Indo-European influences, but they did rule Egypt. So they entered Egypt around 1700, which would put that maybe it was parallel to the story of Jacob. And then, of course, you have the Exodus story set around the time of Amos the First, around 1550, which is much more persuasive chronologically. It is a very, very interesting topic of discussion, but the general archaeological consensus is first that Exodus is a national origin myth, created perhaps from stories linking it back to the Hyksos invasion or penetration. There is some doubt as whether the Hyksos penetrated Egypt slowly and took over, or was there more violent, aggressive, short-term campaigning Either way, the Hyksos did conquer Egypt, did rule Egypt. They established certain dynasties. The 15th and 16th dynasty are associated with the Hyksos. And because of that, the stories that remained were adopted much later by a king of Judah, King Josiah, who attempted to create a unifying monotheistic ideology in order to confront the threats and the dangers posed by being surrounded by greater kingdoms such as Egypt and Assyria. This begins to develop a kind of movement towards monotheism. It isn't really Judaism. Judaism, as we know it, comes in during the Second Temple period, much later, and it does arise from a substrata of stories that remained and legends that permeated the region. These were later adopted and transformed in order to exalt the role of a national deity who would protect the Jews or the Hebrews against the surrounding powers. And King Josiah was the first Messiah, if you will. Well, I just wanted to kind of test this out. Hopefully, people will find it interesting and comment on it.